Hi there, it's Kristen from k.becca, and in this project I'll be using Silhouette's new adhesive stencil sheets to make a bold, distressing stenciled background. The new stencil sheets are a great supply to have on hand if you incorporate stenciling and/or masking into your papercraft projects. You can die cut the material with your digital die cutting machine, and the adhesive on the back of the material is temporary and reusable, so you can store the stencils or masks and reuse them again and again. In a recent video, I shared how beautifully stencils cut from this material perform as watercolor masks, and if you'd like to check out the video, the link should be popping up right about now. For today's project, I'll be using the stencil material with Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'll be using distress inks to stencil the background. First though, I want to cut my stencil. As I mentioned in my earlier video, this stencil material is sturdy and on the thicker side, and I double cut it twice on blade setting 10 with my Silhouette Cameo die cutting machine, so 4 passes total with the machine. This is the large circle stencil that you can find in my shop, and I'm using the 6" by 6" size for this project. You can see how cleanly it cut from the stencil material, and how easily I can peel it away from the backer paper on the sheet, which my die cutting machine did not cut through. After I peel that off, I'll set it back down on the stencil sheet, and I'll grab a pre-cut top-folding A2 size card base. This is basically a sheet of 8.5 by 11" paper that's been cut in half vertically and folded at the halfway point. I want to make sure that none of the distress ink goes onto the back of the card, so I'll tape off the area right above the fold using Post-it tape, which has the same temporary adhesive as a regular Post-it note, but in tape form. If you don't have Post-it tape, you can use any low-tack, easily removable tape, such as painter's tape. After that area is masked off with the Post-it tape, I'll line up the stencil that I cut earlier over top of the front of the card base. Angle it a little and press it in place. Since the stencil is wider than the card base and has the temporary adhesive on the back, it adheres the card base in place too, which is nice because you don't have to worry about anything moving around while you work. Next, I'm going to grab the distress inks, and the colors that I'll be using are Mustard Seed, Carved Pumpkin, Picked Raspberry, Abandoned Coral, Seedless Preserves, and Dusty Concord. To apply the ink, I really like using these little foam daubers that fit right on your finger. I'll load a clean dauber with ink by repeatedly and firmly tapping the dauber onto the ink pad, and I'll stencil the ink onto the cardstock using a sort of swirly circular motion, trying to keep the pressure as even as I can as I apply it. I'm going for a pretty bold look here and want all of the stenciled circles to be evenly colored, as opposed to an ombre look where the color fades out from left to right. So I'll reload my dauber when the ink coverage starts to get lighter and continue to stencil the first row of circles. When I'm finished stenciling that first row, I'll grab a clean foam dauber and move on to the next distress ink color and repeat the process of loading the dauber with ink and stenciling the ink onto the cardstock in a circular motion. I'll continue doing this for all of the rows of circles using a clean foam dauber for each color. The background stenciling actually goes pretty quickly. I was able to do the whole thing in about, I'd say, 10 to 15 minutes. After I finish up with that last color, which is Dusty Concord, I'm going to very carefully peel the stencil off of the cardstock. You'll notice as I'm peeling off the stencil that a small area in one of the abandoned coral colored circles on the right tore a little. There were a few additional areas where the cardstock tore a bit too, so I think that the adhesive on the stencil might be a bit too sticky for this 80-pound cardstock. I've tried the stencil material with both Canson XL watercolor paper and Strathmore Bristol smooth paper, and it worked beautifully with both of those. So if you're using the stencil material with this type of cardstock, you might want to de-stickify it by sticking it to an old t-shirt or a piece of fabric to remove some of the stickiness, like some people do with new cutting mats before using them. After I remove the stencil, I'll also remove the piece of Post-it tape that I used to mask off the back of the card and set the card aside for just a minute while I clean the ink off of the stencil and the silicone craft mat using a baby wipe. To store the stencil, you can either stick it back onto the stencil sheet that you cut it from and cut off that piece so you can cut other stencils from the unused portion of the sheet, or you can do what I like to do and store it by sticking it onto one of the backer sheets from an old cutting mat. To finish the card, I'll trim off about 1/8 of an inch from each side of the card. I'm doing this to cut off the part of the one circle where the cardstock tore as I was removing the stencil, and I also cut off the same amount from the other side to even out the pattern. Finally, I'll attach this sentiment that I made by setting it up as a print and cut file in Silhouette Studio and foiling it using the Mink and Mink Rose Gold reactive foil. You can find out more about my print and cut hot foiling techniques in the videos from the playlist link that should be popping up right about now. I'll add 3D foam adhesive squares to the back of the sentiment die cut because I want to give this piece some dimension. You can easily cut these foam squares into smaller pieces using scissors if you need to. After the back is covered with foam squares, I'll peel off the protective backer paper and adhere the sentiment in place on the center of the front of the card to complete the design. You can find a full list of supplies used in this project in the description area below, or in the area below the video if you're watching on k.becca.com. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to see more handmade card projects, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll tune in again soon.